to Interviews from Quito. My name is Gregory Wilpert, and my guest today is Alice Loaiza, who is a sociologist, retired university professor, and Colombia solidarity activist. We'll be talking about a variety of issues relating to Colombian politics. And first of all, welcome, Alice. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So what I first want to start with, before we're getting into Colombian politics, is I'd like to hear a little bit about your own political involvement in Colombia, how you got involved in this kind of solidarity activism. What is your background with regard to that?
Well, I've lived many years in Colombia, and I lived almost 30 years in Colombia. And being part of a country and a society, it's very difficult not to be involved and not to know what's going on. So that was part of my activity in Colombia, was participating in certain things in Colombia, solidarity with Colombia. I now live in the Bay Area of San Francisco in California in the United States. And I work with two different organizations with Colombia Solidarity. One is BALASC, which is the Bay Area Latin American Solidarity Committee. And the other one is Task Force of the Americas. And they both organizations do a lot of solidarity work with different Latin American countries. And they were both very happy to have someone representing the Colombian case there, because there was nothing going on for Colombia when I arrived there 2 years ago.
Well, it's great you're able to join us now in Quito on a brief visit here. And so let's look at what's happening in Colombia. As some people who are following the Colombian situation might know, right now there have been peace negotiations going on for almost 3 years, and they're practically in their end phase right now. At least that's the way it looks. What is your assessment of that process, and where is it at? I mean, what are the chances? How do you see this moving forward in the next couple of months?
The FARC very seriously wants to lay down its arms and become a political movement within the society. I think they've gone into the negotiations with a very clear platform of what they want, but they do not want to go in and sign anything that doesn't bring certain social justice and different programs for the poor of Colombia. Their agrarian reform is very serious. Their victims program is very serious of the truth and taking care of the victims' needs in Colombia. Many of these things have been negotiated, and they're all kind of common sense. What the peasants need, what the victims need, political participation within the society, the substitution of cocaine with other crops with the aid of the government. These are all things that are pretty much common sense, and the government has signed a lot of things. The problem is that the government hasn't created any mechanisms for carrying through on the agreements, on the accords that have been signed in Havana. And that's a big problem. It's a big worry for people in Colombia as well as those in Havana. And so it's kind of at a standstill now. There's also been a bilateral ceasefire, but it's not really been bilateral. It's been more on the side of the guerrillas who've laid down the arms, and they're still being attacked by the army forces in Colombia. So those are some of the problems that are on the table now with the peace talks, and they're looking to be resolved. Another thing that's important is that the ELN will also enter into negotiations, is now in the planning of the negotiations with the Colombian government, and their site for negotiations would be Ecuador.
Mm-hmm. Right, and in terms of one of the things that you've also looked at is the U.S. involvement in this process, and one of the contentious issues, of course, has also been the extradition, for example, of Simon Trinidad to the U.S. and the idea that he would be also involved in the negotiations. Can you talk a little bit about his case and also other cases of political prisoners and how that affects this whole process? Yeah,
there's a big discussion about how many political prisoners there are. There are prisoners of conscience and prisoners of war. They're pretty much divided into that, and the prisoners of war, of course, are the guerrillas that have been arrested. And one of the points is an amnesty, and the hope for having an amnesty before the agreement goes off the table, before the negotiations end, of having that agreement of amnesty and getting political prisoners out of prison. There's a huge discussion about how many there are. it goes from 12,000 to 4,000. It's very difficult to identify political prisoners in the jails because they're very hidden by the government. They're very isolated. Also, many political prisoners fear of saying that they're political prisoners because they fear for their families. They've been threatened. So there are many people who are political prisoners who don't identify as political prisoners in the jails. Even during the peace talks, there's been an enormous amount of repression in the country, and many people have been arrested. For example, the case of Ube Ballesteros, who's a peasant and popular movement leader, very important leader in Colombia, was arrested 5 days after the general strike, the national strike of 2013, of August 2013. And he was jailed and accused of aggravated rebellion, which is another way of saying terrorism. He's been in a high security prison, and he is he was only with 2 other political prisoners, and the rest of them are paramilitaries, which is a threat. It's a danger for him to be where he is. Also, Miguel Angel Beltran was recently re-arrested, who is a professor from the National University. There's a lot of arresting of people and a lot of bad treatment of the political prisoners in the jails. They really have no way of getting out. They have terrible conditions. There are a number of videos on YouTube that you can see the conditions of the prisoners and the general population as well as political prisoners. But in general, political prisoners are isolated from each other, so they can't build a community, and it's very hard for them to build their cases to try to get out of jail because they're so isolated. The conditions are really bad. There are many young guerrillas who are in jail, who've had broken bones, who've been shot, who are ill. In the videos, you can see that they've never been treated for broken bones, and many of them have broken bones that are completely haven't been set, and they've healed completely in a deformed way. There are many who have cancer. There are some political prisoners who have cancer, others who have SIDA, a number of different problems that they have, and the state doesn't respond. There are certainly international agreements about how political prisoners should be treated internationally, and Colombia does not follow any of those rules for political prisoners. They're very poorly treated.
So one of the key issues in this whole peace process is, like you said, an amnesty. Can you say a little bit more also about what the connection is between the peace process and the broader social movements? I mean, you mentioned also earlier that the peace process is very relevant for the social movements in Colombia. What is the connection between the two, the peace process and the social movements?
Well, the government in the United States like to say that that the guerrillas are drug lords, that they don't do anything except get rich on drugs, and that they're not very popular, and that nobody really likes them, and that they just see them as basically as criminals. And that's absolutely not true. It's in many of the peasant areas of Colombia, the peasants have felt very protected when the guerrillas are present, due to the paramilitaries and the militaries and the constant killings of peasants in the countryside. Many of the poor in Colombia listen to the guerrillas and agree with what they're proposing for the peace talks. And so and everybody is very tired of the war in Colombia. It's been a long war. The insurgency war has been approximately 51 years now. And so people are very much ready to find some better conditions in life and to stop the war. And so there's a great interest in what the FARC is proposing in Havana.
One of the key factors, of course, and not just in Colombia, but also in all of Latin America, has been the presence of the United States government in various forms, in various ways, its involvement in intervening in the politics of the region. What is the situation right now in Colombia? We know that that there's a number of military bases. What is the impact that the U.S. Involvement in Colombia currently having in terms of the political organizing of activists and also in terms of the peace process?
Well, I'd like to go back a little bit because I think it's important to understand the U.S. has been very involved since the 19th century in Colombia. It's been very interested in and found a lot of interest of the ruling class. The elite of Colombia has always been very pro-U.S. And you can go back and talk about the United Fruit massacre, where the United Fruit Company called in the army, the Colombian army, to come in, and they massacred approximately 2,000 people at the United Fruit plantations in 1928. There's also been the Alliance for Progress with Kennedy. There's been a number of things where the U.S. has been very involved in Latin America, and especially after World War II, the U.S. considers Latin America their personal pizza, and so they are really very involved in building that. As capitalism grows and the needs of capitalism grow, it's really interesting how the politics change in Latin America. And Colombia is a very, very rich in resources country, and it's also a very, very friendly country. It's not a country where the elite have any need for sovereignty. They adore the U.S. They want the U.S. to fill their pockets. And so they've been very open to anything the U.S. wants from them. So the U.S. has slowly built Colombia into a police force for Latin America and a police force in many ways for the world, which I'll explain later. But if we start with Plan Colombia, Colombia has a very poorly dressed, poorly armed, incapable, corrupt army that they're capable of at the end of the 1980s, with the creation of the paramilitary forces. Somehow the Colombian army and the paramilitary forces were able to kill thousands and thousands of people. And it's amazing that the Colombians can still lift their head and still organize and still resist after all of the repression they've had. So from the 1980s, for example, the UP, which was a popular coalition that participated in elections in the 90s, 5,000 of those people were massacred. There were many, many massacres, Mapiripan, Trujillo, there were just many, many massacres that were of resistance. The United States was involved in them, but then they polished their show with Plan Colombia. They put in millions of dollars. They built a very well-equipped, well-dressed, well-armed military. There were lots of helicopters, lots of top-notch arms. And underneath, the United States moves in and says, well, we're going to make this our base away from home. And when Correa shut the Manta base here in Ecuador, they said, okay, we're leaving. But then they multiplied. They multiplied into 7 bases. And these 7 bases, they say, oh, we're just sharing the space. But it's not true. The spaces are really dominated by the U.S., and Colombian military are used by the U.S. to repress within Colombia and outside of Colombia, which is interesting. But Plan Colombia changed the whole tone and the whole capacity of the Colombian army. The paramilitaries continued through Plan Colombia. They continued with repression. They were more selective. They weren't the massive massacres as before. And it was difficult for the people to rebuild after the massacres and the massive killings and the displacements. Actually, over 5 million people were internally displaced in Colombia because of the paramilitaries and the military. And the U.S. said, oh, we don't know anything about that. Human rights? Is there a problem with human rights in Colombia? And of course there was. And they acted as though they didn't know about it, when they, of course, knew everything that was going on. So when Correa closes Manta, the new military bases are built in Colombia. There was quite a bit of protest about it, but demonstrating on the streets didn't stop them by any means. And so the bases are very strategically organized. Two of them are naval bases on the Pacific and on the Atlantic coast. One is near Sumapaz, that's been traditionally a very, Tolimaida is near Sumapaz, which has traditionally been a very, an area of great resistance by the peasant communities. One of them is in Meta, and it actually serves as a new school of the Americas. And what's really interesting is the role that these bases play. One of them is another school of the Americas in Latin America, and it, for example, in 1 year, trained 4,000 Mexican military in the school. They're very capable of, they've brought many, many people in from other countries, from Central America especially, and from Mexico, to do military training. And most of it's done by US professors, teachers, who come in and do this, military people who come in and do this. And so that's kind of, that base is dedicated to that. Another base is dedicated to intelligence. And there are actually two bases with intelligence collecting. One of them is worldwide intelligence, and the other is in Latin America, intelligence in Latin America. There's one Palanquero that's an enormous airstrip. There's no airstrip in Colombia nearly as big as this one that can handle huge planes bringing in troops and bringing in all kinds of machinery and all kinds of arms. It can house 2,000 troops. There are not 2,000 troops there now, but it's built to house 2,000 troops. It's built to be an independent community with stores and movie theaters and all that stuff. And in any minute that they need to, they can bring troops in and act as a military force from there. Another thing that's really interesting about the military presence is that the U.S. is, again, Colombia being the lackeys of the United States, the biggest lackeys in probably Latin America, they have been able to form Colombians into being the teachers, the military teachers, and they've worked in something like 60 countries. They've gone to Afghanistan, the United Arab Emirates, West Africa, a number of countries in West Africa, and of course Honduras and Mexico and many parts of Latin America. And they do military training of military in these countries, anti-insurgent. They always throw the drugs in because, you know, like in Colombia, they say, oh, it's a drug war, we're going to fight the drugs, which it isn't, of course. And so they've trained all over the world and are presently training all over the world. And it's interesting that a lot of the training they're doing is training that is paramilitary tactics. So the US says, well, we don't really know what they're doing. It's a lie. They know everything they're doing. And probably the 8th military base that is talked about by a number of authors is Bogota. And now they talk about Bogota being a military base because it's the central organization of the military action, US military action in Colombia. And so there are incognito offices of the CIA, the FBI, the Special Forces, the DEA. And that's where a lot of the planning goes on. And there was also discovered a drone office, which was by Semana magazine in Bogota. There was a big article on that, of an office that organized the use of drones in Colombia and the spying with drones.
Wow. Wow. That's really a very heavy involvement. One of the things, though, that some people also have linked it to is, of course, the free trade agreements in some sense, because with the imposition of neoliberal policies, there's more uprisings, and so therefore more repression is necessary. And so it brings me to the next question that I wanted to raise is, I remember that a couple of years ago, maybe it was 10 years even ago, the Democrats were arguing against free trade with Colombia on the basis of human rights concerns. Well, where is that now? I mean, since then, free trade agreements have been signed. What has happened in that regard to Colombia?
Yeah, well, the free trade agreement was bulldozed through in spite of all of the protests and in spite of the opposition to it. And there was even government opposition to the free trade agreement. It was not a popular theme. But they bulldozed it, they got it through. And obviously what they really need is capital growth, and that's what they're looking for. The free trade agreement, as it is in all third world countries, is an agreement that benefits the rich countries and then a few of the people in the third world countries. The United States has many, many, many investments in Colombia. It's broken a lot of the national production in the country in order to build up, in order to make space for the U.S. investments. And the repression for the anti-unionism, for example, within the companies, the U.S. companies in Colombia, continues to be very repressive. Unionists in the 2000s, approximately, and before the 2000s, approximately 2,000 unionists were killed in Colombia, were assassinated. There's still a lot of repression. The unions have been, with the free trade agreement, a lot of the unions have been redirected, let's say. Their leaders are taken to the United States and retrained to kill the union movement, and the union movement in Colombia is not a strong movement at this point. The peasant movement is much stronger than the union movement. There are many conditions that the United States puts on Colombia, as it does many countries, as we saw in Greece also, of the privatization of capital, the privatization of public companies, of the water company, of the education, of transportation, etc. And so those things become much more expensive under the free trade agreement for the Colombian people. Colombia owes a tremendous amount of money, probably more than anybody in Latin America, has a higher debt, national debt, than anybody. That also makes, as with the free trade agreement, it also makes it very, very expensive for Colombians. And the companies continue their repression. I'd like to name a few of the companies. That's interesting. Coca-Cola, which many people are very conscious of what happened with Coca-Cola, of them hiring paramilitaries to assassinate union leaders, which they did. There was a case against them. Also, Chiquita Banana, which was the United Fruit Company, has a court case by a union in the United States for their work with paramilitaries and persecution of people who protested the conditions in the Chiquita company. Drummond, which is a coal company on the Guajira and in Cesar, in 2 different states, are huge open pit mines. They've completely destroyed the communities around them. They don't even employ the people who live in the area. They've ruined the environment in the areas they're in, and they're very, very large open pit mines. The free trade agreement, of course, gives open conditions to the companies that want to come to Colombia and exploit in any way they can.
Well, one of the things, of course, that the whole process of mining and so on has been also a major issue for throughout Latin America. And but what is the reaction of the social movements there to this kind of extractive type of politics and well, I mean, I assume that also, I mean, well, you already suggested it, that the people who are organizing against that are being repressed. What's going on in terms of in that movement and the mining efforts?
Well, mining and petroleum and gas, and there's been a lot of protests against the mines, the Drummond mines. There have been a lot of protests against the petroleum in Putumayo, for example. Let me say one thing that's really interesting. In 2007, in an effort to react to the beheading of the movements in Colombia by so much violence and so much repression, approximately 400 groups came together that are peasant organizations, came together and formed what's called the CONAP. And the CONAP is the National Coordination of Agrarian and Popular Organizations in Colombia. It was mostly peasant. It was mostly peasants in the formation, although there were students, there were women, there were other indigenous groups. There are other groups, but the main force of that is peasant groups. And the mines that you talk about, and the petroleum, and a lot of the exploitation is done in rural areas. So with the formation of this coordination, it brought together the movements that had been really alienated one from another. It brought them together with a program of 18 points. And one of those points, of course, is to, for the environment, the exploitation of the country, the foreign companies that come in. So there began to be, like in Putumayo, there were protests against the petroleum companies. And the videos of it are really interesting. ESMAD is the anti-riot police in Colombia. They dress completely like black, big plastic, heavy uniforms and helmets and the whole deal. I mean, you can't even see there's a person inside practically. And you see them running through the jungle, fighting with the peasants who are protesting against the Exxon company. And so there's a lot of protest, and so that, of course, that protest becomes a national protest because the peasants have been able to organize again into a national organization, a national coordination. So everybody's very, very present and very, very conscious of what's going on in different parts of the country. And so those protests are brought out through a lot of national movement.
Well, it seems to me that one of the big hopes, of course, is that once the peace process is concluded, that finally politics in Colombia will be able to normalize and people will be actually able to organize and perhaps even win and change the government. But I guess that's perhaps a little bit further down the line. We'll have to see what happens. Fortunately, we've reached the end of our time. But thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for joining us at Interviews from Quito. My guest was Alice Loaiza, and hope to see you next time. Thanks.